The horn cracked across the delta at first light, and Emmett Bailey's hands froze around the arrow shaft he was smoothing. He knew that sound. 3 short blasts, then a long one that dragged out over the reed beds like a dying animal's cry. The Ashguard's hunting horn. He set down his knife on the porch rail of his stilt house and stood, squinting through the morning mist that clung to the channels of Grayreed Landing, and that was when he saw her. She came running across the mudflats at the edge of Miller's Cut, leaping from one half-submerged root to the next with a grace that should not have been possible for someone her size, orc-tall and broad through the shoulder, a bow slung useless and broken across her back. Behind her came 4 men in the ash-gray coats of the marshal's patrol, one of them with a hound straining at a rope leash, another already raising a crossbow to his shoulder. Emmett did not think. He had spent 11 years building bows and shaping arrows for every hunter and guardsman on this stretch of border, and his own longbow was leaning against the porch post where it always leaned, strung and ready because a man who lived alone in the swamp learned quickly that snakes did not wait for permission. He had it in his hands and an arrow knocked before the crossbowman had finished raising his weapon. "Don't," Emmett called out, and his voice carried flat and hard over the water. "Lower it." The crossbowman turned, saw a lone Fletcher standing on his own porch and laughed. "Stand aside, Bailey. That's a Stormbound scout marked and running. Ashguard business." "She's running through my water," Emmett said. "That makes it my business." He loosed before the man could answer. The arrow did not take flesh. Emmett Bailey had never in his life put an arrow into a person, and he was not about to start now. But it took the crossbow itself, striking the stock so hard the weapon spun out of the man's hands and dropped into the black water with a splash. The other 3 froze, and in that frozen heartbeat the orc woman changed direction, cutting hard toward Emmett's own dock, water sheeting off her boots. "Loose the hound," one of the men shouted, and the animal surged forward, baying. Emmett had a second arrow knocked before he'd finished the thought. He put it into the mud 6 inches from the hound's front paws, close enough that the animal yelped and scrambled backward, dragging its handler half off his feet. It was the finest kind of shooting, the kind men paid him good silver for, the kind that had made his name known from Grayreed Landing to the garrison towns 2 days upriver. Not a killing shot, never a killing shot if he could help it, but a shot that ended an argument all the same. "That's twice I've spoiled your morning," Emmett called out, drawing a 3rd arrow just to let them see he had more. "Go home and tell the Marshal Emmett Bailey says the Delta's got enough ghosts in it without him adding more before breakfast." The men cursed him, but they were not fool enough to wade into the deep channel after an armed man who could put an arrow through a crossbow at 40 paces, and after a long, ugly moment of muttering, they turned back toward the landing, dragging their hound with them. Only then did Emmett lower his bow and look at the woman who had collapsed, gasping, against the near post of his dock. She was orc, unmistakably green-gray skin darkened at the cheekbones with old sun and older scars, tusks small and neat where they showed past her lower lip, black hair braided back tight and threaded through with beads of river glass that marked her, he would learn later, as a scout of standing among her people. She wore travel leathers cut close and snug to her frame, a fitted bodice of dark hide reinforced at the ribs with bone plates, laced tight up the front, the leather worn soft and supple from years of swamp work, wrapped boots laced to the knee, a long knife at her hip where her broken bow had failed her. Even soaked through and bleeding from a shallow cut along one forearm, she was, Emmett thought with an honesty that startled him, one of the most striking creatures he had ever laid eyes on, not despite her size and strength, but because of it, the raw competence of her, the way she held herself even exhausted and hunted like a woman who had never once in her life considered herself prey. "You should not have done that," she said, in common accented thick and low, her golden eyes narrowing at him with something that was not quite gratitude. "You're welcome," Emmett said. "I did not ask for a human's help." "No," Emmett agreed, lowering himself onto one knee at the edge of the dock, close enough to see the cut on her arm was deeper than he'd first thought. "But you've got it anyway. Come inside before that hound remembers his courage." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing him the way a woman weighs a stranger's knife before she decides whether to trust its edge. And then, because the alternative was bleeding out on a dock in enemy territory, she let him help her up the ladder into his stilt house. Her name, she told him once he'd bound the cut with clean linen and set a kettle over his small hearth, was Murak Stormbound, scout of the Stormbound clan, and she had been 3 days deep in Ashgard territory watching the purge patrols push farther into the delta than any treaty allowed, when a patrol had put a crossbow bolt through her bowstring and given chase. "The purge," Emmett said, and something bitter crossed his face. "It's gotten worse this season. They're not just hunting witches anymore. Half the delta thinks anyone with a birthmark or a strange dream is marked for the sunken cells. They hunt my people because we are already marked," Murak said, "by the color of our skin if nothing else." Emmett had no answer for that because it was true, and he had watched it be true his whole life. He should have known, sheltering her, that he was buying himself trouble that would not stay quiet for long. He was right. By the second night, word had already crept through Graried Landing that the Fletcher had shot at Ashgard men over an orc. And by the third morning, a delegation was climbing his dock ladder that included, to his considerable dismay, Marshal Josiah Fenwick himself. Fenwick was a broad, silver-bearded man who had taught Emmett to true a bowstring when Emmett was 9 years old and freshly orphaned, who had sat with him through the worst of his grief and never once made him feel like a burden, who had stood as close to a father as Emmett had known since the raid that took his own. Seeing him climb up onto the porch now, flanked by 2 Ashgard in their gray coats, Emmett felt a knot of old affection and new dread tangle together in his chest. "Emmett." Fenwick's voice was warm, the way it always was, and that warmth was exactly what made the visit feel so wrong. "I hear you've been busy. I hear you've been hunting scouts through my water," Emmett said. Seemed like a fair trade of news. Fenwick's eyes flicked past him to where Murak stood in the doorway, arm bound, chin lifted, refusing to look anything but dangerous, even wounded. "This is the Stormbound scout the men lost. She has a name," Emmett said. "Murak." Of course, Fenwick's smile did not waver. He turned it on Murak with the ease of a man who had spent decades talking his way through delicate rooms. "Scout Stormbound, your clan sent word yesterday through the usual channels. Your war chief wishes a parley, wants the Ashgard patrols to stop pushing into Stormbound water before some fool on either side starts a war nobody survives." "Then hold the parley," Murak said flatly. "I intend to." Fenwick spread his hands. "But the council in Graried is frightened, Murak Stormbound, and frightened councils do not sign treaties with strangers. They need to see good faith, something they can point to and say, 'Look, the wall between us is not so high after all.'" Emmett felt the direction of the conversation before Fenwick said the words outright, and something cold slid down his spine. "What kind of good faith?" he said. Fenwick turned that warm, fatherly smile on him now, and for the first time in 20 years Emmett did not trust it at all. "A courtship, Emmett, public, visible. The Border's best Fletcher and the Stormbound clan scout, walking the market together, sharing a boat, letting the whole town see that peace is not only possible between our peoples but already happening under their noses. It buys us time enough for a real treaty to be drafted while the council's fear cools." "You want us to lie to an entire town," Emmett said. "I want you to save one," Fenwick said, and there was iron under the warmth now. "You saved her life on your dock 3 days ago, boy. Would it truly cost you so much to save it again, in front of witnesses this time?" Murak's gaze had not left Emmett's face throughout this exchange, and when he finally looked at her, he found something unreadable in her golden eyes, not quite pleading, because Murak Stormbound did not plead, but something close enough to it that he felt it land in his chest like a struck arrow. "My brother leads our war band," she said quietly. "If this buys him time to argue for peace instead of retaliation, I will do it. I have done harder things for my clan than pretend to court a human." It was not, Emmett would think later, the most flattering thing a woman had ever said to him. But it was honest, and honesty from Murak Stormbound, he was already beginning to understand, was worth more than pretty words from anyone else. "All right," he said. "We'll play their little theater, for your brother, for the treaty." "For the treaty," Murak agreed, and neither of them in that moment believed it would be anything more than that. The market at Graried Landing sprawled across 3 connected platforms of lashed timber and packed earth, stalls selling smoked eel and river reed baskets and dyed wool crowding the boardwalks. And when Emmett Bailey walked out onto the central platform 3 days later with Murak Stormbound at his side, every conversation within 40 feet died at once. He felt the weight of it like a physical thing, dozens of eyes swinging toward them, the particular quality of silence that came before either violence or gossip, sometimes both. Murak walked beside him with her chin lifted and her shoulders squared, dressed still in her fitted travel leathers, because she owned nothing else and would not have worn anything else even if she had. And Emmett found himself falling into step half a pace ahead of her without deciding to. Some old instinct in him wanting to stand between her, and the crowd stares, even though she was a head taller than he was, and considerably more dangerous than anyone watching. "You are hovering," Murak murmured, not looking at him. "I'm protecting the Alliance," Emmett said. "Fenwick's orders." "You are hovering," she said again, and there was the faintest curl of amusement at the corner of her mouth, quickly hidden. An old woman selling river glass beads spat at their feet as they passed, and Emmett felt his jaw tighten, but Murak only glanced down at the spittle, and then up at the old woman with an expression of such flat, unimpressed calm that the old woman flushed and looked away first. A pair of children peered at Murak's tusks from behind their mother's skirts, wide-eyed with a curiosity that had not yet curdled into fear, and Murak, to Emmett's considerable surprise, bared her teeth at them in what he eventually understood was meant to be a friendly smile, sending both children into a fit of delighted giggling. "You're good with them," he said. "I have 4 younger cousins," Murak said. "Children are children, whatever skin they wear." They stopped at his usual stall, where old Tomas Ferry sold Emmett's arrows alongside his own nets and hooks, and Tomas, who had known Emmett since he'd first arrived in Graried as a hollow-eyed boy of 16 with nothing but a bow and a grief, he couldn't speak of, looked between Emmett and Murak with open curiosity rather than hostility. "Well," Tomas said, "the Fletcher's finally taken up with someone who could actually best him in a fight. About time somebody did." "She hasn't tried yet," Emmett said. "Give it time," Murak said, and Tomas laughed, a real laugh, and something in Emmett's chest loosened at the sound of it, at the proof that not everyone in Graried Landing was going to spit at their feet. It became a rhythm over the following 2 weeks, the theater of it. Walking the market arm in arm, though neither of them had discussed whose idea the arm-in-arm part had been. It had simply happened the first time a group of Ashguard passed too close, and Emmett's hand had found the crook of her elbow, and she had not pulled away. Sharing a reed boat on the wide, slow channel that ran past his stilt house, poling together through hidden waterways she knew better than he did despite having lived here only weeks, teaching him currents his whole life on the Delta had never shown him. Sitting together at the corner table of the flooded lantern, the town's one tavern, while men who had known Emmett for a decade came by to clap him on the shoulder and murmur, not unkindly, that they'd never have guessed the quiet Fletcher had it in him. The proximity of it, forced and constant, wore at Emmett in ways he had not expected. He had lived alone in his stilt house for 11 years, had grown so used to solitude, he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to have another warm body moving through his small rooms, reaching past him for a cup, brushing his shoulder as she passed to check the window latch. And every one of those small, ordinary touches landed on him now like sparks against dry reed. It came to a head on a night 3 weeks into the arrangement, when a knot of drunk Ashguard men cornered them both against the tavern's back wall as they were leaving, one of them shoving Murak hard enough to slam her shoulder into the timber. "Pretty theater, orc," the man slurred. Everyone knows what you really are under the leathers. Marked. All of you." Emmett moved before he'd finished speaking. He did not have his bow, a man did not carry a longbow into a tavern, but he put himself between the drunk man and Murak with his hands loose and ready at his sides, and something in his face must have carried more warning than his slight frame usually managed, because the man hesitated. "Touch her again," Emmett said, very quietly, "and I will make sure every hunter from here to the garrison towns knows you're the reason their arrows started missing. I true every shaft that leaves my shop. I can just as easily true them a little wrong, and no one will ever prove it was me." It was, perhaps, an empty threat. Emmett had never once sabotaged his work and never would, but the man did not know that, and the threat to a hunter's livelihood cut deeper in that moment than a threat to his body would have. The drunk men slouched off into the dark, muttering, and Emmett let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Murak was staring at him. "You would not truly have done that," she said. "No," Emmett admitted. "But he didn't know that, and it worked, and here we both are still standing." "You stood between me and 4 armed men with nothing but words," Murak said, and there was something new in her voice, something that had shed its earlier wariness like a snake shedding old skin. "I have watched warriors twice your size run from less." "I'm not a warrior," Emmett said. "I make the arrows warriors use. That's all I've ever been good for." "That is not all you are good for," Murak said low, and reached out to straighten the collar of his shirt where the drunk's shove had knocked it askew, her fingers lingering half a second longer than the task required, and Emmett felt his pulse stumble. The wound came 4 nights later, when a patrol that had grown suspicious of the Fletchers' frequent nighttime trips into the deep channels. Murak still scouted for her clan even during the theater of their courtship, slipping out most nights to watch the Ashguard's movements and report back through hidden signal fires, nearly caught them both crossing open water. An arrow meant for Murak's back took Emmett instead, a glancing hit along his upper arm as he shoved her sideways into the reeds, and though the wound was shallow it bled with alarming enthusiasm, and by the time they'd pulled the boat the last half-mile home in the dark, his sleeve was soaked through. Murak worked in silence once they'd climbed the ladder into his stilt house, stripping his shirt away with hands that had clearly bound 100 field wounds before, cleaning the cut with river water boiled clean, and a poultice of crushed marshroot she produced from a pouch at her belt, her touch far gentler than her size or her scowl of concentration would have suggested. It was in the lantern light of that quiet aftermath, while she was tying off the linen wrap over his fresh wound, that her gaze caught on the older scar just below his collarbone, pale and long-healed, a thick ridge of tissue that ran from the point of his shoulder nearly to the center of his chest. She went very still. Then slowly she reached out and traced it with one finger from top to bottom, her touch feather-light against skin that had carried the mark for 17 years. "Tell me," she said, "every story behind this." Emmett looked down at her finger resting against his chest, and then up at her face at the golden eyes that had gone soft and searching in a way he had not yet seen from her, and something in him that had stayed locked for 17 years quietly, finally, opened. "I was 15, he said. "There was a raid, not your clan. This was long before you were born, probably. A war band out of the deep swamp that didn't answer to any chief who honored treaties. They hit our homestead at dawn. My father was already dead by the time I got outside. I never even saw it happen. I just remember running out and finding him in the yard. My mother was trying to get me and my sister to the boat." Murak's hand had gone still against his chest, but she did not pull it away, and Emmett found that he did not want her to. "One of the raiders came at her with an axe," he said. "I got between them. I don't remember deciding to, I just remember being there, and then the blade, and then being on the ground looking up at the sky and thinking, very calmly, that I was going to die, and it didn't hurt as much as I'd have thought." "You saved her," Murak said quietly. "I bought her 10 seconds, Emmett said. "It was enough. She got my sister into the reeds. I thought I was going to bleed out in that yard, and I would have, except he stopped, and something in his throat worked before he could go on. Except there was an old orc woman with the warband. A healer, I think, or something like one. She wasn't fighting, she was just there, the way healers travel with warbands sometimes to patch up whoever needs patching after. She looked at me bleeding in the yard, and I looked at her, and I was certain she was going to finish what the axe started. But she didn't, Murak said, and it was not a question. She knelt down next to me, Emmett said, and she pressed something into the wound. I never even knew what, some kind of moss, I think, something that stopped the bleeding, and she said, in common, rough common, barely more than a few words strung together, "Boy, live. Not all blades want you dead." And then she was gone back into the swamp with the rest of them, and I lived. My mother found me an hour later, half conscious, packed with moss, and she never understood how I hadn't bled out, and I never told her, because I don't think she'd have believed me. I don't think anyone would have believed that an orc raider stopped to save the boy her own warband had just cut down. Murak's finger moved again along the length of the scar, slower now, as if she were reading it like a line of script. "That is the first story," she said. "You said every story." Emmett let out a breath that was almost a laugh, startled by how much she'd heard in his words, how precisely she'd caught that there was more. "The second story," he said, "is that I spent 2 years after that hating every orc I saw on sight, every single one. I wanted to be a soldier, wanted to march to the border and put an arrow through every green-skinned thing I could find, because it was easier to hate all of you than to sit with the fact that the woman who killed my father and the woman who saved my life wore the same face to my grieving eyes. I trained with the town garrison. I was good with a bow, better than good, better than boys twice my age. And the garrison captain, seeing that, sent me to the border to serve under Marshal Fenwick's command, because Fenwick had a reputation even then for training the Delta's finest archers." "Fenwick," Murak repeated, something wary entering her voice. "He was kinder to me than my own grief let me be to myself," Emmett said. "He saw a boy who wanted to kill something to make the pain stop, and instead of handing me a war, he handed me a craft. He taught me that a bow could be more than a weapon, that the truest shot a man could make wasn't always the one that killed. He's the reason I make arrows instead of loosing them at men. He's the reason I never became the soldier I thought I wanted to be." Murak said nothing to that, though something crossed her face too quickly for him to name it. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, though at the time Emmett read it only as fatigue. "And the third story," he said, quieter now, "is that I still don't know the healer's name. I never will. But every year on the day of the raid, I leave a bundle of moss at the edge of the deep swamp, in case some part of her still walks it, so she knows the boy she chose to save grew up and chose not to hate. That scar isn't a wound to me anymore, Murak. It's a promise I made to a stranger who didn't have to be kind, and I've spent 17 years trying to keep it." Murak was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting flat against his chest now. Over the scar, he was suddenly, dizzyingly aware, the steady hammer of his heart beneath it. "Among my people," she said finally, "a scar given in mercy instead of malice is called a second birthmark. It means the spirits judged you worth keeping. I did not know humans carried such stories too." "Most humans don't," Emmett admitted. "Most humans would tell you that scar means an orc nearly killed me and leave it there. They wouldn't ask about the second half." "I am not most humans," Murak said, and the corner of her mouth curved. "And you are clearly not most orcs' idea of a human either, Fletcher, or you would not be sitting here shirtless letting one trace old wounds with her finger and tell you stories of birthmarks." "You asked for every story," Emmett said, his voice rough now, very aware of how close her face had drifted to his, how her hand had not moved from his chest. "I gave you every story." "Then let me give you one of mine," Murak said, and reached up with her other hand to pull aside the collar of her leathers at the shoulder, revealing a jagged white scar of her own, 3 parallel lines like claw marks, though he would learn later it had been a blade, not a claw. "This one is from my first true battle, when I was 19 summers, against a raiding band that struck my clan's outer camp. I killed the man who gave me this before he could give me worse. It is the scar that made my brother trust me to scout alone. It is the reason I am considered worthy to speak for my clan in matters like this one." She paused. "It is the reason I did not run from a Fletcher's dock 3 weeks ago, even wounded and outnumbered. I have never run from anything that mattered, and something in me already knew that morning that you would matter." Emmett reached up slowly, giving her every chance to stop him, and traced her scar the way she had traced his one finger, featherlight, over 3 pale lines that told a story of survival and pride. "I'm glad you didn't run," he said. "So am I," Murak said, and then there was no more space between them at all, her mouth finding his with a certainty that startled them both, warm and searching and utterly without the pretense that had brought them together in the first place. Emmett's hand slid up into her dark hair, careful of the river-glass beads woven through it, and Murak's arms came around him with a strength that could have crushed him and instead held him like something precious. And when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily in the lantern light, the fiction of their courtship lay in ruins between them, replaced by something neither of them had planned for, and both of them, it turned out, wanted with an intensity that frightened them a little. "This was meant to be theater," Murak said against his jaw, not pulling away. "It stopped being theater somewhere around the 3rd week," Emmett murmured. "I think it stopped being theater the day you first bared your teeth at those children in the market, and I realized I wanted to see you do it again." Murak laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, a sound he had not heard from her before and one he immediately wanted to hear for the rest of his life, and kissed him again, slower this time, and outside the lantern-lit windows of the stilt house, the delta settled into its usual night sounds, frogs and distant owls and water lapping at old pilings, indifferent to the fact that 2 hearts inside had just quietly, irrevocably changed course. The weeks that followed were the finest of Emmett Bailey's life, and also the most dangerous. The purge did not slow simply because 2 hearts had found each other in a stilt house at the edge of the swamp. If anything, it sharpened. Word came from the inland garrisons that the Sanctum Council had grown impatient with the pace of cleansing along the border, and Marshal Fenwick, who had once seemed to Emmett a man of measured warmth, began appearing in the market with a harder look in his eye, ordering tests for anyone whose neighbors whispered too loudly about strange dreams or unlucky harvests. The tests were water tests, an old, cruel superstition dressed up in the sanctum's authority, where the accused was bound and lowered into the channel. If they floated, they were marked, and if they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent too late to matter. Emmett had watched, sick to his stomach, as an old widow named Greta Loom was dragged to the town dock and tested for the crime of owning a black cat and speaking to it too fondly, and had only been saved from drowning by the desperate intervention of her grandson, who dove in after the rope had already pulled taut. "This cannot continue," Murak said that night, pacing the small floor of Emmett's stilt house with the barely restrained energy of a woman who wanted to put an axe through something. "Your marshal grows bolder every week. Soon it will not only be widows with cats, it will be my people, dragged to that same dock and no rope to cut them free." "I know," Emmett said. "I've known Fenwick 20 years, Murak. I've never seen him like this. Something's changed in him, or something was always there, and I was too grateful for his kindness to look for it." He did not know, that night, how right the second half of that sentence would prove to be. The parley, when it finally came, was set for the open green at the heart of Grayreed Landing, the one patch of dry, solid ground the Delta town possessed, ringed by stilt houses and market stalls, and on the day itself, by nearly the entire population of the town, drawn by curiosity and fear in equal measure to watch orc and human stand face to face for the first time in a generation, without weapons drawn. Murak's brother, Tor of Stormbound, war chief of the Stormbound clan, arrived with an honor guard of a dozen scouts, all of them in fitted battle leathers, all of them radiating the particular calm of warriors who did not need to prove their strength because everyone already knew it. Torv was broader even than Murak, his tusks longer, a battle scar cutting across one eyebrow, and when he embraced his sister in front of the entire watching crowd, something in the tension of the green eased just slightly at the evident, unfeigned love between them. "You have grown thin, sister," Torv rumbled, in Orcish first and then courteously in common for the crowd's benefit. "This human courtship has not fed you well." "This human," Murak said, taking Emmett's hand and drawing him forward without hesitation in front of everyone, "has kept me fed, sheltered, and alive for 2 months, brother, while your patrols argued about treaty language in the safety of camp. Mind your tongue." A ripple of surprised laughter went through the Stormbound honor guard, and even a few of the watching townsfolk smiled despite themselves, and Emmett felt something loosen in his chest at how easily, how naturally, Murak had claimed him in front of her own kin. No hesitation in it at all, nothing of the careful theater they had begun with. It was Marshal Fenwick who mounted the small speaking platform at the green center once the pleasantries had exhausted themselves, and it was Marshal Fenwick's voice that carried out over the crowd, warm and measured as it had always been, right up until the moment it was not. "Friends," Fenwick began, "we gather today to witness what many of you doubted possible, a peace between our peoples, built not on treaty ink alone but on something truer. Emmett Bailey, whom many of you have known since he was a grieving boy fresh off a raided homestead, has found it in his heart to love a daughter of the very people that raid took his father from. If that is not proof enough that the wall between us can fall, I do not know what is." Emmett felt Murak's hand tighten in his, and he understood in that moment that whatever came next was not going to be the treaty ceremony they had all gathered expecting. "But I have learned something troubling in recent days," Fenwick went on, and his gaze swept the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly how to hold an audience. "I have learned that this courtship, this touching proof of peace you have all watched unfold across our market and our tavern these 2 months was never real at all. A performance. A lie agreed upon between the Fletcher and the Scout to buy the Stormbound clan time while their scouts continued to slip through our territory gathering intelligence on Ashgard movements. Is that not so, Scout Stormbound?" The green went utterly silent. "You proposed the courtship," Emmett said, his voice cracking across the silence like a whip. "You stood on my own porch and told us to lie to this entire town for the sake of the treaty. You cannot stand there now and call it treachery." "I proposed a gesture of good faith," Fenwick said smoothly, never dreaming the Stormbound clan would use it as cover for continued spying. "But scouts do not stop scouting, do they, Murak Stormbound?" Even while pretending affection for the man who saved her life, she slipped out most nights to signal her war band with news of our patrols. Ask her if I lie." Every eye on the green turned to Murak, and Emmett watched her face, watched the flicker of something that was not quite guilt but was close enough to it to be mistaken for it by a frightened crowd, because it was, in fact, true. She had scouted, every night exactly as her duty to her clan required, exactly as any Ashgard scout would have done in her place for their own side. "I scouted," Murak said, refusing to look away, refusing to shrink even as the crowd's murmur turned uglier around her. "I am a scout of the Stormbound clan. It is what I am, what I have always been, and I will not apologize for protecting my people from patrols that have pushed into our water 11 times this season alone, in direct violation of the old treaty lines your own Sanctum Council agreed to 20 years ago. Ask your marshal how many of those violations he ordered." "Lies," Fenwick said, but something flickered across his own face now, quick and gone, and Emmett, who had known this man for 20 years, who had learned to read every one of his moods across a decade of apprenticeship, recognized it instantly for what it was. Fear. "He's lying," Emmett said slowly, the pieces sliding into place with sickening speed. You're not enforcing the sanctum's orders at all, are you, Josiah? You're the one pushing patrols past the treaty line. You've been doing it for months. That's why the purge escalated, not because the sanctum demanded it, but because you needed a war scare bad enough to justify seizing the Delta trade routes for yourself before the inland lords could parcel them out to someone else. You dare, Fenwick began, but Emmett was already moving, stepping up onto the edge of the speaking platform itself, in full view of the entire assembled town, and something in his quiet, steady fury commanded attention in a way Fenwick's practiced oratory never quite had. "You taught me to shoot true," Emmett said, and his voice shook now, not with fear but with a grief he had not expected to feel, grief for the father figure he was watching crumble in front of him. "You told me a bow could be more than a weapon. Was that a lie too? Or did you mean it once before you decided a purge was more profitable than peace?" Fenwick's composure cracked at last, the warmth sloughing off his face like a mask finally too heavy to hold. "The sanctum pays well for Delta ledgers cleared of complications," he said, low and vicious now, no longer performing for the crowd but speaking only to Emmett, as if the two of them were alone. "Trade routes worth more gold than you will see in your lifetime, boy, and all I needed was a boarder frightened enough of witches and orcs to stop asking who truly profits from the fear. You were meant to be useful, a grieving orphan I could shape however I liked. I never imagined you'd grow a spine and fall in love with the wrong monster while you were at it." "She's not a monster," Emmett said. "She's the bravest, most honest person I have ever known, and if loving her makes me useless to you, then I am glad, finally, to be useless." "Seize them both," Fenwick snarled, dropping all pretense now, and the Ashguard ringing the green's edge surged forward, and for one terrible, chaotic moment the green dissolved into shouting and shoving as townsfolk scattered and stormbound scouts drew their blades, and Torv roared his sister's name across the chaos. Emmett did not have his bow, he had left it at home, a fool's mistake he would never make again, but Murak did not need him to have one. She moved with a speed that belied her size, wrenching a spear from the nearest Ashguard's grip and using its haft, not its point, to sweep the man's legs from under him, spinning to place herself bodily between Emmett and the three men closing on the platform. "Touch him," she snarled, "and you will learn exactly what a stormbound scout does to men who threaten what is hers." "Murak," Emmett said, breathless, "the peace pole." It was an old law, one Fenwick himself had taught him as a boy, learning the Delta's customs, half forgotten and rarely invoked. Any arrow loosed into the carved peace pole at the green center during an active dispute called an immediate, binding halt to violence until the town elders could convene to judge the matter, a relic from an older, more careful age, when disputes had been settled by law rather than by whichever side held more blades in the moment. Emmett had no bow. But Torv's honor guard did, and one glance at Emmett's desperate gesture toward the weathered old post at the green's heart was enough for a stormbound scout to understand and act, loosing a single arrow that thudded deep into the ancient wood with a sound like a dropped gavel. The old law held, even now, even in chaos generations of superstition and genuine legal weight enough that every Ashguard on the green hesitated, blades half raised, uncertain, because to violate the peace pole's judgment was to invite a curse older than any of them wanted to test. Into that frozen, uncertain moment, Elder Prudence Yates, gray-haired and formidable, the closest thing Grayreed Landing had to a mayor, pushed her way to the platform's edge. "The pole has spoken," she said, her voice carrying with the authority of decades spent settling market disputes and fishing rights. "There will be no seizing of anyone until the elders have heard the whole of this. Marshal Fenwick, you will explain these accusations of ledgers and sanctum gold, or you will explain your silence, but you will explain something here, now, in front of this town." Fenwick's eyes darted, calculating, and Emmett, watching the man who had shaped so much of his life reduced to this cornered, glittering desperation, felt something that was almost pity beneath the anger. It was a young Ashguard soldier, barely older than Emmett had been the day of the raid, who broke the silence, stepping forward with visible reluctance and producing from inside his coat a leather ledger, water-stained but legible. "I found this in the marshal's strongbox 3 nights past, doing inventory," the young man said, voice shaking. "I did not know what to do with it. I still do not. But I think the town should see it before anyone else is dragged to the water for a crime the marshal invented to line his own pockets." The ledger passed hand to hand up to Elder Yates and read aloud in a voice that grew harder and colder with every line, told a plain and damning story. Payments from an inland trading consortium, dated back over a year, for every delta acre cleared of orc claims and witch accusations, a bounty scaled to the value of the trade route each cleared parcel opened up. Josiah Fenwick had not been enforcing a purge ordered from above. He had invented one, fed the Sanctum Council carefully curated fears to win their blessing, and grown rich on the terror of a town that had trusted him for 20 years. The silence that followed the ledger's reading was worse, in its way, than the earlier chaos. A silence full of townsfolk recalculating every water test, every accusation, every widow dragged screaming to the dock, against the knowledge that the man who had ordered it all had been paid, coin by coin, for their fear. "Arrest him," Elder Yates said, quiet and final, and this time it was Ashgard men themselves, sickened by what they had just heard, who moved to bind Fenwick's wrists, and the man who had taught Emmett Bailey to true a bowstring 20 years before went white and silent and did not fight them at all, as if some part of him had known this reckoning was always waiting somewhere down the road he had chosen. It took the better part of an hour for the green to settle, for the crowd's shock to burn down into something more like exhausted relief, for Torv Stormbound and Elder Yates to begin, cautiously, the real work of the treaty the day had originally promised. But Emmett barely registered the details of it, because Murak had not moved from beside him since the moment the peace pole's arrow struck home, her hand still fitted into his, and when at last the immediate danger had passed and the crowd's attention turned elsewhere, she turned to face him fully, in full view of the green, in full view of her brother and the elders and every townsfolk who had spat at her feet or laughed with her at Tomas Ferry's stall. "I do not care any more who is watching," she said, low and rough. "I have pretended enough for one lifetime, Emmett Bailey. I am done pretending anything about how I feel for you." "Good," Emmett said, and his voice cracked on the word, "because I don't think I could have kept pretending much longer either." She kissed him then, in front of the whole of Grayreed Landing, in front of her brother's honor guard and Elder Yates, and the Ashgard leading their disgraced marshal away in chains. And this time no one on the green so much as murmured a protest, because whatever doubts they had carried about orc and human finding something real together had just been burned away by the sight of a scout who had risked capture rather than abandon him, and a fletcher who had stood on a speaking platform and named his own mentor a traitor rather than let her be dragged to the water. The days that followed were, in their own way, as eventful as the confrontation on the green had been, though the danger in them had turned at last toward paperwork and negotiation rather than blades. Torv Stormbound and Elder Yates spent 3 long days hammering out the terms of a real treaty, one that redrew the old patrol boundaries with actual honesty this time, that established a standing council of both human and orc representatives to hear grievances before they curdled into violence, that formally ended the water tests, and the purge both, root and branch, with the disgraced Fenwick's ledger entered as evidence against every sanctum official who had turned a blind eye to convenient gold. Emmett found himself, somewhat to his own bemusement, invited to sit at the edge of those negotiations as a witness of good faith, and Murak sat beside him through every session, translating the finer points of orcish custom when the human elders grew confused, her hand finding his beneath the table more often than either of them would have admitted to the room at large. It was Torv, on the evening the treaty was finally signed, who sought Emmett out alone on the dock outside the stilt house, the water gone still and copper-colored with sunset, and studied him for a long moment with the same weighing look Murak had given him the very first night. "My sister has never given her heart lightly," Torv said finally. "She gave it to our clan first, and to our mother's memory second, and I did not think there was room in her for a third thing, let alone a human Fletcher with an arm too thin for real weapons." "I've heard worse insults from your sister," Emmett said, and Torv barked a laugh, sudden and warm. "She told me of your scar," Torv said, more quietly now. "The story of the healer who spared you. My people tell a similar tale of that same warband, the one that struck outside treaty lines 17 years past, Grosk's fangs. They were called, outlaws even to us, disowned by every honest clan on the Delta. If the healer you describe still lives, she is likely an old woman now, living apart from any clan, ashamed of what her warband became. My sister has already sent scouts to search the deep swamp for her, should you wish to finally thank her yourself." Emmett had not expected, that had not dared to hope, in 17 years, that the debt he carried might ever be more than a private ritual of moss left at the swamp's edge, and something thick rose in his throat at the thought of it. "Tell your scouts," he said, "that I would be grateful beyond words." "I will tell them," Torv said, and clapped a broad hand on Emmett's shoulder hard enough to stagger him. "Take care of my sister, Fletcher. She is worth 10 of any warrior in my warband, and if you break her heart, I will personally see to it that your arrows fly crooked for the rest of your days." "I have no intention of breaking anything but the silence I've kept for 17 years, Emmett said, and meant it with his whole chest. The formal ceremony, when it came 2 weeks later, was not the quiet, private thing either of them had once imagined stumbling into by accident. It was, instead, exactly the sort of grand, public spectacle the whole Delta seemed to require after months of fear and suspicion. As if the entire town of Grayreed Landing had decided, collectively, and without quite discussing it, that it needed a celebration large enough to wash away the memory of water tests and hunting horns. The green where Fenwick had been unmasked was strung instead with lanterns and river-glass beads, tables groaning with smoked eel and fresh bread and jars of blackberry wine, and at its center, where the peace pole still stood with the honor guard's arrow yet lodged in its ancient wood, Torv Stormbound himself performed the old clan rite that bound a stormbound scout to her chosen mate. Not a wedding in the human sense, but a claiming, formal and fierce, in which Murak pressed her palm flat against Emmett's chest, directly over his old scar, and declared before her clan and his town both that she had chosen him, freely, with clear eyes, and would defend that choice against any who questioned it. "I choose this man," Murak said, her voice carrying clear and unashamed across the crowded green, "not because a marshal ordered it not to buy time for a treaty, but because he stood on his own porch with nothing but a bow and a stubborn heart, and decided a stranger's life mattered more than his own safety. I choose him because he carries scars that taught him mercy instead of hatred, and because he never once, in all our months of pretending, made me feel like anything less than exactly what I am." Emmett, in turn, pressed his palm against the pale cloth scar at her shoulder, the one she had shown him that first tender night, and found his own voice steadier than he expected. "I choose this woman," he said, "because she never once let me hide from what I truly felt, because she traced an old wound with one finger and asked for every story behind it, and in giving her those stories I found I finally had someone to share them with. I have been alone in this Delta for 11 years. I do not intend to spend a single day of the rest of my life that way again." The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd, human and orc both, stormbound scouts and Grayreed fishermen and Elder Yates herself, wiping her eyes with the corner of her shawl, was loud enough to send a flock of herons startling up from the reeds half a mile distant. And Emmett Bailey, who had spent so many years believing himself unremarkable, overlooked, a quiet craftsman destined to grow old alone with nothing but his bows for company. found himself instead swept up into the arms of the fiercest, most magnificent woman he had ever known, lifted clean off his feet to the delighted roar of the crowd, kissed soundly enough to leave him breathless and laughing at once. Later, much later, after the lanterns had burned low and the tables had been cleared, and the last of the wine jars stood empty on the green, they walked back together along the boardwalk to the stilt house that had once been his alone, and was now, unmistakably, theirs, and Murak paused at the foot of the ladder to look back at him in the moonlight. "Every story," she said softly, echoing the words that had cracked his heart open weeks before. "You gave me every story behind that scar, Fletcher, and I do not think you understand yet what a gift that was. My people do not give their trust so easily to those who have not earned it in blood, and yet you gave me yours in truth instead, and it was enough. It was more than enough. You gave me yours in return," Emmett said. "A scar for a scar seemed only fair." "There will be more scars," Murak said, climbing the ladder ahead of him, glancing back over her shoulder with a look that promised warmth and trouble both in equal, delicious measure. "I am a scout, and scouts collect scars the way fletchers collect feathers. But I intend for every single one of them to have a story worth telling you, for as many years as we are given." "Then I intend to be here for every telling," Emmett said, following her up into the lantern-lit warmth of the home they had built together out of a lie that had, somewhere along the way, become the truest thing either of them had ever known, and the delta settled around them into its familiar night sounds, frogs and owls and water lapping gently at old pilings, no longer indifferent witnesses to two lonely hearts but quiet company to two hearts finally, fully found.